There is a kind of quiet that only exists outdoors in the deep cold long after the fire has burned down to its last orange threads. I want you to sit with me in that quiet tonight. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. What I have for you is very old and very human, and it starts on a night when the only thing standing between a family and the whole of the sky was a small flame in each other. For nearly the entire span of our existence, human beings had no walls at all. No door to close, no roof to keep the rain honest. No room to retreat into when the wind turned cruel. For roughly 2 million years across the birth and death of countless generations, survival came down to a single brutal fact. If you could not find shelter or build warmth from nothing, the night itself could kill you. Not a predator, not an enemy, just the dark and the cold and the absence of a wall. Picture a woman on an open plain in the depths of an ice age somewhere in what is now Central Europe more than 20,000 years ago. There is no village behind her. There is no hut. There is only frozen grassland stretching in every direction, pale under a moon that offers no warmth at all, and a wind that has been building since dusk. She kneels beside a small fire dug into a shallow pit, feeding it with dry grass and bone fat, because wood is scarce out here, and every scrap of fuel has to be chosen with care. In her arms, wrapped in stitched hide, is an infant. She has walked most of the day following the herds her family depends on, and now there is nothing to do but wait out the dark and keep that fire alive until morning. She does not think of this as suffering, not exactly. It is simply what a night is. But her whole body knows the stakes. If the fire goes out and the wind does not ease, the cold will take the smallest and weakest first. It always does. She has buried enough of her own kin to know this without needing to be told. So she stays awake, feeding small handfuls of fuel into the flame, listening to the wind move across the grass, like something breathing and waiting for a sky she cannot control to loosen its grip. What strikes me most when I sit with a scene like this is how ordinary it would have felt to her. This was not a single terrible night in an otherwise safe existence. This was simply life repeated across hundreds of generations in nearly every climate our species ever crossed into. What we now take completely for granted, a wall, a roof, a door that shuts, did not exist for most of human history. It had not been invented yet. And that raises a question worth sitting with in the dark. If we had no shelter for so unbelievably long, how did we survive at all? How did a soft-skinned, slow, relatively fragile primate make it through ice ages, through blizzards, through nights exactly like the one that woman spent awake beside her fire? The answer is not simple, and it is not fully settled even now. Scholars still debate exactly when our ancestors first moved from merely finding shelter, a cave mouth, an overhang of rock, to actually building it with their own hands. But the evidence that survives buried in caves and frozen soil across 3 continents tells a story far stranger and more resourceful than most people ever learn. It involves lions competing with humans for the same stone shelters. It involves circles built from the bones of mammoths deep inside caves no daylight has ever touched. And it involves a shift in thinking so fundamental that it may be the true beginning of everything we now call home. Before we go further into that story, I want to ask a small favour if you are enjoying this so far. Taking a moment to follow along and leave a like helps this kind of long, unhurried history reach more people who might need exactly this tonight, a story to sink into, rather than something loud demanding their attention. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what drew you to a story like this one. I always find it moving to picture how far a single quiet story can travel. For now though, get comfortable, let your eyes close if they want to, and let's go back to the beginning. Because that woman on the frozen plain and her fire and her sleeping child is only one small moment near the very end of a much longer story. To understand how she came to be there, holding warmth together, With nothing but grass and bone, fat and sheer will, we have to go back further still. Back past the first true dwellings, past the first deliberate walls ever raised by human hands, back to a time before fire was even fully tamed, when our earliest ancestors slept in trees, the way their primate cousins still do, vulnerable to everything that moved in the dark below them. We have to walk through nearly the entire span of human time on this earth, watching a fragile, clever species slowly, painfully, brilliantly work out how to hold the world's cruelty at arm's length, one small shelter at a time. That is the story waiting for us tonight, stretched across ice and stone, and unimaginable stretches of time, and it begins as so much of our history does in a world with no walls at all. Let me set the scene properly now, because to understand what came later, you first have to understand the world these people were actually born into. Strip away everything you know about human comfort. No walls anywhere on Earth, no roofs, no doors. Now picture that absence stretching across every continent our ancestors ever crossed for a period of time, so long it becomes difficult to hold in the mind. The earliest members of our broader human family appear in the fossil record more than 2 million years ago in the open grasslands and woodland edges of eastern Africa. And for well over 1 million of those years, shelter in any form we would recognize today simply does not exist. What did exist was exposure in the most literal sense. Early hominins lived their entire lives outdoors at the mercy of a climate that shifted dramatically across the ages, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling speed. Ice ages came and went in long, grinding cycles, each one lasting tens of thousands of years, each one reshaping the map of where a body could survive at all. During the coldest stretches, ice sheets crept down across northern Europe and Asia, locking so much of the planet's water into glaciers that sea levels dropped, and entire coastlines shifted outward, exposing land bridges that do not exist today. Africa, meanwhile, swung between lush, well-watered periods and long droughts that turned open savanna into something closer to desert. Our ancestors did not choose this instability. They were simply born into it generation after generation with no permanent structure to soften any part of it. Sleep itself looked nothing like what we know. Our earliest tree-dwelling ancestors likely slept the way chimpanzees and gorillas still do today, weaving simple nests of branches and leaves high in the canopy each night, safe from the leopards and hyenas that hunted the forest floor below. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A nest rebuilt fresh every single evening, abandoned every morning, offering no permanence at all, only a few hours of relative safety before the whole thing was left behind. As our ancestors began spending more time on open ground following herds and searching out new sources of food, that arboreal safety net began to fall away. The forest thinned, the trees grew sparser, and increasingly our ancestors were sleeping at ground level in a world shared with some of the most formidable predators the earth has ever produced. It's worth naming exactly what shared that landscape, because it changes how you hear everything that follows. Saber-toothed cats moved through the grasslands of early human Africa, animals built with jaws capable of delivering a killing bite far beyond anything a modern lion can manage. Giant hyenas hunted in packs. Cave bears, which would come later in Ice Age Europe, could stand well over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, and their dens were fiercely defended territory that early humans sometimes had to fight for, quite literally tooth against stone. There were no walls to keep any of this out. There was awareness movement in numbers, and whatever natural cover the land happened to provide on a given night, a rock overhang here, a dense thicket there, and very often nothing at all beyond the presence of other bodies close by. And yet something remarkable was already beginning. Something that most people never learn happened this early. The controlled use of fire, one of the single most transformative developments in the entire human story, appears to stretch back much further than most people assume. Sites in South Africa, particularly a cave complex known as Wonderwork Preserve, burned bone and ash, dated to roughly 1 million years ago, among the oldest reasonably secure evidence anywhere on Earth for hominins deliberately managing flame, rather than simply encountering it after a lightning strike. This did not mean fire was easy or constant or reliable. It likely meant carrying embers carefully from one resting place to the next, tending a flame with the same anxious attention that woman on the frozen plain from the very start of this story gave her own small fire tens of thousands of years later. But even an unreliable fire changed everything it touched. It pushed back the predators that would otherwise have circled closer after dark. It offered warmth on cold nights. It cooked food, which in turn changed digestion, changed nutrition, and very possibly changed the trajectory of human brain development itself. Scholars still debate exactly how early and how consistently that fire use began, because ash and burned bone can sometimes be difficult to distinguish from natural wildfire residue, especially at sites this ancient. The evidence remains incomplete, and the honest answer is that we are reconstructing a very old, very faint signal from an extraordinarily thin archaeological record. But what is not in real dispute is this. Long before any human hand ever stacked a stone wall or lashed together a frame of branches, fire was already doing quiet essential work. It was the very first tool against the dark portable in a way no cave or rock shelter could ever be, and it travelled with these early humans wherever they went. Shelter, when it existed at all in this era, was almost entirely a matter of what the land was willing to offer. Caves, rock overhangs, the lee side of a hill angled just enough to break the worst of a prevailing wind. None of these were built. They were found and often fought over and abandoned again the moment the group moved on following game animals or fresh water, or simply the changing of a season. This is a critical detail that is easy to miss if you picture early humans as living anything like a settled existence. They were not settled. They were profoundly, constantly mobile, walking enormous distances across their lifetimes, carrying almost nothing with them beyond what could be held in the hand or slung across the back. A cave that sheltered a family for one winter might never be seen by that family again. There was no concept yet of a place that belonged to you that waited for your return. There was only the next likely shelter somewhere ahead, uncertain until you actually reached it. I find something quietly moving in that, honestly. An entire species moving through tens of thousands of years of history with no fixed point on Earth to call its own. No threshold to cross each evening. Just the ongoing search renewed every single day for somewhere that might keep the cold and the predators and the wind at a manageable distance until morning. And it is worth remembering that this was not a brief transitional phase quickly outgrown. This mode of existence, mobile shelterless in any permanent sense, endured for well over 90% of the entire span of time our genus has existed on this planet. What we now consider the most basic feature of a normal life, 4 walls and a roof that stays in place from one night to the next, is in the full sweep of human history an almost shockingly recent invention. But something was shifting slowly beneath the surface of all that constant movement. As early humans grew more skilled with fire, more deliberate in choosing their resting places, more attentive to the particular shape of a good rock shelter versus a poor one, a kind of accumulated knowledge was building itself into the culture passed down without ever being written anywhere, because writing itself was still hundreds of thousands of years away. And somewhere within that slow accumulation of hard-won survival knowledge, the first genuinely new idea in this entire long story was quietly taking shape. Not a shelter found, a shelter made. That last thought is worth pausing on, because it marks a genuine turning point in this story, even if it did not feel like one to the people living through it. Nothing about this shift was sudden. There was no single morning when someone woke up and decided to invent architecture. It came instead the way most real change comes slowly through generations of small adjustments, each one barely noticeable on its own, each one built quietly on top of the last. The first step in that direction was not building anything at all. It was learning to choose. As early hominin populations spread outward from Africa, moving into the varied and often much harsher landscapes of Europe and Asia, they began encountering natural shelters in an enormous range of shapes, sizes, and quality. Not every cave is equal, and not every overhang offers the same protection. A shallow cave mouth facing directly into a prevailing wind might be nearly as exposed as open ground. A deep limestone cavern with the narrow entrance, on the other hand, could hold warmth from a small fire for hours, trap it against stone walls and offer genuine safety from both weather and predators in a single location. Learning to read a landscape this way to recognize which shelter was worth the walk and which one was a trap waiting to happen was itself a form of intelligence being sharpened across thousands of years, passed from one generation to the next through nothing more than observation and example. One of the clearest windows we have into this world comes from a cave complex near modern Beijing in China known to archaeologists as Zhukudian. Beginning roughly 750,000 years ago, and continuing on and off for an extraordinarily long stretch of time after that, groups of an early human species we now call Homo erectus returned again and again to this same set of limestone caves. What makes this site remarkable is not simply that people sheltered there. It is what survives inside those caves today, thick layers of ash-charred bone and burned stone built up over so many centuries of repeated use that in places the ash deposits reach several meters deep. This was not a single desperate fire lit once and never repeated. This was habit. This was knowledge held collectively that this particular set of caves in this particular location was worth returning to, worth trusting year after year, generation after generation. I want to sit with that idea for a moment because I think it is easy to move past too quickly. A cave with no name, no owner, in any sense we would recognize on the outskirts of what is now one of the largest cities on Earth, held meaning for human beings across a span of time so long it dwarfs the entire recorded history of every civilization that came after it. These were not permanent homes. Groups still moved on following food and water and the turning of seasons, but certain places, certain caves had begun to hold a kind of memory, a rightness, a reason to come back. And it was not only comfort that drew people back to shelters like this, it was necessity sharpened by exactly the kind of danger we have already touched on. Zhokudian's caves were not empty when early humans arrived. The bones found alongside human remains there include those of an extinct species of giant hyena and of a cave-dwelling relative of the modern leopard animals that would have viewed the same shadowed limestone chambers as their own established territory. A good cave, in other words, was rarely simply available. It often had to be claimed, sometimes through confrontation, sometimes simply by outlasting a den's previous occupants after they had moved on to hunt elsewhere. Delta. This early in the story was never separate from competition. Every cave worth having was in some sense contested ground. It's against that backdrop that the next development becomes so striking because it represents something genuinely new entering the story for the first time. Not the discovery of shelter, but the deliberate construction of it. On the southern coast of France, near the modern city of Nice, archaeologists in the middle of the last century uncovered a site now known as Terra Amata. What they found there, preserved in ancient beach sand dated to roughly 400,000 years ago, was a series of oval-shaped patterns of post holes and stones arranged in a way that many researchers interpreted as the remains of deliberately built shelters. simple frames of branches driven into the sand, likely covered with hide or brush, with a central hearth positioned inside for warmth. If that interpretation holds, it would place the very first known constructed dwellings in human history remarkably early built, not by our own species, which did not yet exist, but by an earlier human relative, likely a form of Homo erectus, or a closely related population capable of an entirely new kind of thinking. Not simply where is shelter, but how do I make shelter here now with what I am carrying and what I can gather nearby? I want to be honest with you about something here, because this channel only means anything if it tells you the real complicated story rather than the tidy one. Terra Amata has become one of the most debated sites in this entire field. Some archaeologists remain fully convinced by the original interpretation that these post holes represent genuine, deliberately built huts, among the oldest architecture ever constructed by any hominin anywhere on Earth. Others argue the patterns could plausibly result from natural processes, from wind-blown sand settling around driftwood, or from other post-depositional disturbance that only resembles intentional construction after so much time has passed. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly what those sandy post holes on a French beach truly represent. This is not a flaw in the story. It is simply the honest texture of working this far back in time, where the traces left behind are often faint, fragile, and open to more than one reasonable reading. But here is what I find most worth holding on to, regardless of exactly how that particular debate eventually settles. Even if Terra Amata itself remains uncertain, the broader trajectory it represents is not in serious doubt at all. Somewhere in this vast stretch of deep time, human ancestors did cross a genuine threshold, moving from a species that merely used what shelter the world happened to offer, to a species capable of imagining a structure that did not yet exist, and then building it with their own hands out of branches, hide, and whatever else the land provided. That shift, whenever and wherever it first truly took hold, may be one of the most quietly consequential moments in our entire evolutionary story. It is the seed of every wall raised since, every roof, every threshold ever crossed on the way in from the coal. It's worth remembering too what this kind of construction actually demanded of the people attempting it. Building even the simplest shelter requires more than physical labour. It requires the ability to hold an image in the mind of something not yet real, to plan a sequence of actions across time, rather than simply reacting to the present moment, and to cooperate with others toward a shared goal that will not pay off immediately. A hastily built windbreak does not keep out the cold the moment the first branch is planted in the sand. It only works once the frame is complete, once the covering is secured, once the whole structure stands as intended. That kind of patient, forward-looking cooperation invested before any reward arrives represents a genuine cognitive leap, and it likely did not happen everywhere at once. It is far more probable that this ability emerged gradually, unevenly tested and lost, and rediscovered across different populations and different eras, long before it became anything like a reliable, widespread practice. And so what we are really tracing here across these earliest chapters is not a single invention with a clean date attached to it. It is the slow halting emergence of an idea tested against real cold, real hunger, real danger refined a little more with each generation that survived to pass its knowledge forward. Fire tamed, caves chosen with growing skill. And now, at least in some places, at least some of the time, the first tentative frames of branch and hide rising against an open sky, built by hands that had never known a roof their own, imagining one into existence anyway. None of this made life safe, not yet, not by any measure we would recognize today. The world these early builders inhabited remained one of ice ages that could last for tens of thousands of years of predators that had not yet learned to fear human beings the way they eventually would, of long migrations across landscapes that offered no guarantee of shelter at the end of any given day's walk. What had changed quietly and irreversibly was something harder to see, but just as real. A door had opened in human thinking that would never fully close again, and once that door opened, once a group of early humans somewhere first understood that shelter did not have to be found, that it could instead be made, the story that follows begins to move in a very different direction toward caves held onto for entire seasons, toward the first real mastery of fire as a constant companion rather than an occasional gift, and toward pressures building on the horizon that would soon make the old way of surviving wandering, searching opening the land would provide no longer nearly enough. Something shifts once shelter becomes a choice rather than only a discovery, and it shifts in a direction that might surprise you. Human groups do not immediately begin building everywhere constantly the way we might imagine looking back with modern eyes. Instead, for an extraordinarily long stretch of time that follows, the greatest advances happen not in construction, but in mastery of the shelters the earth already provides. This is the era when caves stop being merely useful and become something closer to home in every sense, except permanence. Consider a rock shelter in what is now the northeastern Spain, a broad overhang of stone known today as Abric Romani, carved out by a river over countless centuries. What archaeologists found there layer beneath layer beneath layer is almost difficult to describe without pausing to let it land properly. Across roughly 40,000 years of use, spanning many generations of Neanderthal occupation, more than 200 separate hearths were built at this single location one after another, each new fire laid down on top of the ashes of the last. 200 fires in one place across a span of time so long that the earliest of those hearths and the most recent were separated by roughly the same distance in years as separates us today from the earliest cave paintings ever made. And still, generation after generation, families return to this exact overhang of stone, laid their fire in roughly the same spot their ancestors had chosen and settled in for another season. I find myself wondering when I picture this whether the people building each new hearth at Abric Romani understood how long their kind had been coming back to this particular place. Did they know they were adding to something ancient? Or did it simply feel to them the way a familiar room feels to us, unremarkable, obvious, exactly where a fire belongs without any sense of the deep history layered in the ash beneath their feet? What sites like this reveal is a level of sophistication in cave living that goes well beyond simply taking cover from the rain. Excavations at rock shelters across Ice Age Europe show clear evidence of organized living space, distinct areas set aside for different purposes within the very same shelter. One zone for the central hearth and the activities clustered around its warmth, cooking, gathering, likely conversation of a kind we can only imagine. Another zone often near the shelter's edge for the messier, harder work of preparing hides and butchering meat kept deliberately apart from where people slept and ate. This was not accidental. It reflects a working knowledge refined and passed down across countless winters of exactly how a shared living space needs to be organized if a group of people are going to share it well night after night, season after season. And these caves were not silent, empty shelter. There is a particular kind of evidence easy to overlook that speaks to just how alive these spaces truly were. In several well-preserved Ice Age caves across Europe, archaeologists have found the small, delicate bones of children mixed among adult remains and tools alongside miniature versions of the same implements found throughout the rest of the site. Tiny scrapers, tiny points sized for hands, far smaller than an adult's. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how much of this reflects deliberate teaching versus simple imitation children, shadowing the adults around them and mimicking their work with whatever scraps were available. But either way, it paints something quietly moving, a picture of these caves, not as grim survival outposts, but as places where skills were passed hand to hand across generations, where a child might have sat near the fire trying clumsily at first to shape a stone the way an older sibling or parent already could. Clothing too was undergoing its own quiet revolution during this same long era, and the evidence for it comes from an almost unbelievable source. Researchers studying the genetics of human body lice, a parasite that can only survive in the folds and seams of worn clothing rather than directly on skin or in hair, have used the rate of genetic mutation in these insects to estimate roughly when clothing itself must have first become a regular part of human life. Their estimates point to somewhere between 170,000 and 80,000 years ago, a range that comes with real uncertainty attached since it relies on assumptions about mutation rates that are difficult to pin down precisely this far back. Still, even accounting for that uncertainty, it suggests something worth sitting with. Long before any needle existed to sew a fitted garment, human beings in colder regions were likely already wrapping and draping cured hides around their bodies as a kind of second, portable shelter, one that travelled with a person the moment they stepped outside the cave and into open, freezing air. This is perhaps the truest description of what shelter meant during this long chapter of the human story. It was never only the cave itself. It was cave and fire and hide and knowledge, working together as a single system, each piece compensating for what the others could not provide alone. A cave without fire is only cold stone. A fire without a cave is exposed to every wind. And a body without clothing, even beside the warmest hearth, remains vulnerable the moment it steps back out into the world to hunt or gather, or simply move to the next shelter when the season demanded it. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this era as one of quiet stability, a comfortable plateau where humans had finally worked out how to live well enough and simply stopped adapting. The climate throughout this period remained anything but stable. Ice ages advanced and retreated across tens of thousands of years, and even within a single lifetime, conditions could shift meaningfully from one decade to the next. A cave that offered reliable shelter for one generation might within a few hundred years find its surroundings transformed by advancing ice, retreating herds, or a landscape simply grown too harsh to support the group that once thrived there. Every advantage won during this era was provisional, held only as long as the fire stayed lit, the hide stayed cured, and the surrounding land continued to provide enough to eat. And there is something else worth naming honestly here, something the archaeological record makes difficult to ignore. Even the best shelter, even the most carefully chosen cave, with its 200 stacked hearths and its generations of accumulated knowledge, could not fully protect against everything. Skeletal remains from this era, when they survive well enough to be studied closely, often show the marks of a genuinely hard existence. Healed fractures are common, the kind that suggest falls or accidents during a hunt, or simple physical strain healed only because someone else in the group cared for that person long enough for the bone to knit back together. This detail matters more than it might first seem. It tells us that even in a world without any form of medicine, as we would recognize it, these groups were capable of sustained patient care for their injured and their vulnerable weeks or months of support given freely, in shelters that offered warmth but never anything close to safety in the modern sense. So this is the shape of human life during what I think of as the long height of the cave-dwelling era. Not primitive in the way that word gets carelessly used, not simple. A rich, hard-won intelligence built cave by cave, hearth by hearth, hide by hide, across a span of time so long it makes the entirety of written human history look almost brief by comparison. And yet for all that accumulated skill, for all that hard-earned mastery of stone and fire and fur, something was still missing from this picture, something that would eventually be tested by pressures far greater than any single cold season or difficult migration. Because caves, however well chosen, are not evenly distributed across the Earth, and as human populations continued to grow and continued to spread into landscapes where good stone shelter simply did not exist at all, a very different kind of crisis was beginning to take shape on the horizon, one that no amount of skill with fire or hide could fully answer on its own. Here is a problem that does not show up in most tellings of this story, but it shaped human survival every bit as much as fire or clothing ever did. A good cave is not a common thing. Think about what a truly livable shelter actually requires. A deep enough overhang to hold heat and turn away wind and rain. Defensible entrance narrow enough to guard, wide enough to move through easily. Dry ground inside, not prone to flooding when the spring thaw arrives. Fresh water within a reasonable walk and game animals worth hunting somewhere nearby. Now picture trying to find a location on Earth that satisfies all of those conditions at once. Limestone landscapes, the kind most likely to produce these ideal caves and rock shelters, through centuries of slow water erosion, are not spread evenly across the world. Vast stretches of the territory, early humans moved into the open steppe of Central Asia. The flat river valleys of Eastern Europe. The windswept grasslands where herds of horses and mammoths grazed in their thousands offered almost no natural stone shelter at all. As human and Neanderthal populations continued expanding into exactly these kinds of landscapes, following the animals that sustained them, they were walking directly into regions where the old solution, simply finding a good cave, was no longer available to them. This is where the story begins to turn, slowly at first and then with real urgency. The climate itself was making the problem worse. Beginning somewhere around 70,000 years ago, and intensifying dramatically as the world moved toward what climate scientists now call the last glacial maximum. Roughly 20,000 years ago, ice sheets thickened across the northern hemisphere on a scale that is genuinely difficult to picture. At the coldest point of this long, deep freeze ice, more than 2 miles thick, covered much of what is now Canada and Scandinavia, and the climate belts that determined where forests, grasslands and tundra could exist all shifted dramatically southward. Regions that had once offered relatively mild forested terrain, with at least some natural shelter available, hardened into open treeless steppes swept by wind, with nothing standing between a body and the sky for miles in every direction. I want you to sit with what that actually meant for the people living through it, because it is easy to hear the phrase Ice Age and picture something abstract, distant, almost geological, rather than personal. This was not weather in the way we think of weather. This was decades then, centuries, then thousands of years of steadily narrowing options. Trees, which had once provided both fuel and building material, grew scarce or vanished entirely across enormous stretches of territory, unable to survive in the newly frigid, wind-scoured conditions. Without trees, there was less wood for fire and almost no timber at all for the kind of branch-framed shelters that groups near the Mediterranean coast in gentler climates had been experimenting with for tens of thousands of years already. The old toolkit cave fire hide was suddenly missing one of its most essential pieces across huge portions of the inhabited world in exactly the regions where the cold was most severe and shelter mattered most. And where good caves did still exist, something else was happening, something the archaeological record makes unmistakably clear. Competition for them was intensifying, and not only among different groups of humans. There is a particular category of evidence that archaeologists have learned to read with real care, because it tells a story that rarely makes it into popular accounts of this era. Deep in certain European caves, layers of sediment reveal an unmistakable pattern of alternating occupation, human tools and hearths, in one layer followed directly above by a layer dense with cave bear bones, and the unmistakable gnaw marks and den debris left behind by generations of hibernating bears, followed again by another human layer above that. This is not evidence of humans and bears sharing space peacefully. Cave bears, some of the largest land carnivores ever to walk Ice Age Europe, competed directly with human groups for exactly the same deep defensible caves that offered the best protection from the cold. In some documented cases, the evidence suggests groups of humans that were forced to abandon a favoured shelter for a season or more, unable to safely dislodge bears that had claimed it first, only reclaiming the space once the bears had moved on, or in some cases once the bears had been killed, an encounter that carried very real risk on both sides. Scholars still debate exactly how frequently these confrontations turned violent, since the physical evidence, mostly bare bones bearing occasional cut marks or human remains showing signs of trauma, can be difficult to interpret with full confidence this far removed in time. But the broader pattern is not really in question. Shelter during this era was never simply a matter of finding the right kind of rock formation. It was a resource finite and unevenly distributed, worth defending, worth fighting for, and sometimes lost entirely to another species that wanted exactly the same protection from exactly the same brutal cold. It's worth pausing here to ask a question that does not get asked nearly often enough in stories about this period. What actually happens to a group of people when the shelter they were counting on simply is not there? Not damaged, not contested, but genuinely absent because the landscape they have walked into offers nothing resembling a cave for 100 miles in any direction. This was not a rare or hypothetical situation. As human populations pushed further into the open plains of what is now Ukraine and Russia, during the depths of this glacial period following the great mammoth herds that had adapted to survive the cold, they were moving into exactly this kind of terrain, spectacular for hunting and almost entirely without natural shelter of any kind. The physical toll of this mismatch shows up clearly in the human remains that survive from this period. Skeletal evidence from Ice Age Europe reveals populations under sustained serious stress bones that show signs of nutritional strain during difficult seasons, evidence of infant and childhood mortality at rates that are difficult to read about without feeling the weight of what each of those small graves represented to the people who dug them. Cold itself, prolonged and inescapable, is a killer that leaves its own particular signature. And while we cannot know the exact cause of death for most individuals recovered from this era, the broader demographic picture that emerges from cemetery sites is one of a population living permanently close to a margin that could tip in a single hard winter from difficult into fatal. And yet this is precisely the kind of pressure that history shows us again and again tends to force genuine innovation rather than simple collapse. Difficult as it is to hold both truths at once, the very severity of this crisis, the total absence of caves across an enormous resource-rich hunting ground, appears to be exactly what pushed certain human groups toward a solution that had never been fully necessary before. If the land itself would not provide shelter, and if trees for a traditional branch frame simply did not grow in these treeless, wind-scoured plains, then shelter would have to be built from whatever material the land actually did provide in abundance. And on the mammoth steppe of the last glacial maximum, one resource existed in genuinely staggering quantity, left behind by the very herds these human groups were already hunting to survive. I will not tell you yet exactly what these earliest steppe dwellers built from that resource, or how strange and remarkable the structures they raised would eventually prove to be, because that discovery deserves its own full telling in its proper place. For now, I want to leave you simply with the shape of the crisis itself, because I think it matters to sit with it honestly before we reach its resolution. Picture a group of people deep in the coldest stretch of an ice age that would last for thousands of years, standing on open treeless ground with the wind moving unbroken across the horizon in every direction. No cave in reach, no forest nearby, and winter closing in faster than the season had any right to allow. Whatever they decided to do next, whatever they built with hands already numb from the cold, would determine quite literally who among them survived the season and who did not. That is the moment we are about to step into together, and it is in its own quiet way one of the most remarkable turning points in the entire story of how we became a species that no longer needs the earth to hand us shelter, because we had finally learned how to make it ourselves out of nothing this world had ever offered so directly before. So let us go to that open ground now and see exactly what these people built. Along the banks of the Dnieper River and its tributaries in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, archaeologists have uncovered something that, when I first read about it properly, genuinely changed how I picture this entire era. At sites with names like Mezhyrish Mezin and Molodova, dating from roughly 23,000 years ago at the more recent end, back to as early as around 44,000 years ago at the oldest site, currently known human groups built substantial, deliberately engineered dwellings almost entirely out of the bones of woolly mammoths. I want to describe this carefully because it is easy to hear that sentence and picture something crude, a few bones stacked loosely together. What was actually found at these sites is closer to genuine architecture. At Mezhyrish, excavators uncovered the remains of a structure built using the bones of at least 95 individual mammoth skulls arranged deliberately in a circular foundation there, weight anchoring the base of the wall against the wind, long curved tusks set into the ground and arched upward to form the rough shape of a doorway, and long bones and jawbones stacked and interlocked above that layer upon layer, almost certainly covered originally with hide stretched over the entire frame to seal it against the cold. The structure would have stood large enough to shelter an extended family group, and the sheer number of bones required to build it raises a question worth sitting with on its own. Where did that many mammoth remains actually come from? Scholars still debate the answer, and it matters because it changes how we understand these people entirely. For a long time, the assumption was that all of this bone must represent the product of organized large-scale hunting, entire herds brought down deliberately to supply both meat and building material at once. More recent research complicates that picture. Isotopic analysis and careful study of the bones themselves suggest that at least some, and at certain sites perhaps a great deal of this material was scavenged, rather than freshly hunted, gathered from mammoth remains that had already died of natural causes and accumulated over long periods across the surrounding landscape, then collected, transported, and repurposed by human groups with real deliberation. The picture that emerges is not simply of hunters. It is of resourceful, patient planners walking the open steppe and gathering exactly the material they needed from whatever the land had already provided, sometimes across many seasons before ever assembling it into a finished shelter. Think about the sheer scale of effort that represents. A single mammoth skull alone can weigh as much as a small car. Moving dozens of them along with the tusks and long bones needed to complete a structure like the one at Mezhyrish, without wheels, without draft animals, using nothing but human muscle ropes made from hide or plant fibre, and probably some form of sledge dragged across snow or frozen ground, was an undertaking that would have required real cooperation across an entire group sustained over what was likely a considerable stretch of time. This was not a shelter thrown together in a single desperate afternoon. It was a structure built with intention, built to last through an entire hard season, and quite possibly reused and repaired across several seasons in a row. Based on the way, certain bones at these sites show wear patterns consistent with long-term standing use, rather than a single brief occupation. And here is the detail that I think deserves real weight, because it reframes everything we have covered so far about the long era of cave dwelling that came before this. These mammoth bone dwellings appear on landscapes that offered no caves at all, No natural stone shelter of any kind for enormous distances in every direction, which means the people who built them were not choosing this approach out of preference over some easier alternative. They were doing something genuinely new because the old solution, the one that had served human ancestors for the better part of 2 million years, simply did not exist here. Necessity in the most literal and immediate sense forced an entirely new category of human achievement into being. Is it too much to call this the true birth of architecture? I do not think it is, not when you consider what it actually required: imagination, planning, cooperation, and the physical execution of a design that existed first only as an idea in someone's mind, long before it existed as a wall. There is another site further west that adds an even stranger and more unexpected layer to this story, one that most people, even those who know a fair amount about the Ice Age, have never heard of at all. Deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, more than 300 meters from the nearest natural entrance, in total darkness that no daylight has ever reached. Explorers in the 1990s discovered something that did not fit any existing expectation for what this era was capable of. Arranged deliberately on the cave floor were several large, roughly circular structures built entirely from broken pieces of stalagmite. The mineral formations that grow slowly from a cave floor over thousands of years, deliberately snapped to length and stacked and arranged with clear intention, some of them showing traces of fire and burned bone. When researchers finally applied modern, highly precise dating methods to these formations several years ago, the results were almost difficult to believe. The structures were roughly 176,000 years old, built at a time when our own species had not yet reached Europe at all. These circles were built by Neanderthals. I want you to really sit with what that means. Deep underground, far beyond any natural light, at depth requiring real effort and no small amount of danger simply to reach, Neanderthal groups more than 170,000 years ago deliberately carried fire into total darkness, gathered broken stalagmite pieces and arranged them into structured shapes for a purpose that remains genuinely uncertain. Some researchers suggest a functional shelter or windbreak within the cave itself, protecting a fire from drafts moving through the cavern's deeper passages. Others have raised the possibility of something closer to ritual or gathering space, given how unusual it is to venture this far from any entrance at all. The evidence remains incomplete, and the honest truth is that we may never fully know what drew a group of Neanderthals into that darkness with fire in hand and the patience to build something so deliberate, so far from the world of wind and weather that shelter is normally meant to answer. But what the discovery makes undeniable is this: the capacity to plan, to organize material with real intention to build something that did not previously exist, was present in the human family in some form tens of thousands of years before our own species had even arrived on the same continent. Taken together, sites like Migrating and Bruniquel push back hard against a story that used to be told far too simply: the idea that architecture, real deliberate building, only began once modern humans arrived, and modern human intelligence supposedly clicked into place all at once. The actual record suggests something far more layered, and I think far more moving. Multiple different human species facing different pressures in different landscapes arrived independently at the same fundamental insight that shelter did not have to be found. It could be imagined first and then built out of whatever material a hard world happened to provide: stone, bone, hide, and enough patience and cooperation to see the vision through to its finished form. None of this erased the danger these groups still lived with. The mammoth bone dwellers of the Ukrainian steppe still faced brutal winters, still buried children too young, still depended entirely on hunts that could fail. A shelter, however cleverly engineered, does not banish an ice age. It only changes the terms on which a family faces it. But those terms mattered enormously, and I think it is worth honouring exactly how much skill, how much accumulated knowledge, how much sheer determination it took to build real walls out of a mammoth skeleton, on ground with nothing else to offer. This is not the story of people simply enduring hardship, passively waiting for conditions to improve. This is the story of people looking directly at an impossible landscape and refusing to accept that it left them with no options at all. And once that threshold had been crossed, once shelter could genuinely be built rather than merely found, an entirely new set of questions began to open up. Questions about how long a structure like this could truly last, what it actually meant for people to return to the same built shelter, season after season rather than simply the same cave, and what price in effort, in danger, in loss, this new way of living against the cold ultimately demanded from the people brave enough to attempt it in the first place. There is a cost to all of this that I have been circling around gently, and I think it deserves to be named directly now without flinching, because that is the promise this channel makes. Not shock, just honesty. Building a shelter out of mammoth bone on the open steppe did not mean safety in any sense we would recognize today. It meant a fighting chance purchased at a price that fell hardest on the smallest and most vulnerable members of every group. To understand what that price actually looked like, we have to look closely at what the dead themselves can still tell us, because the skeletal record from this era carries a story that the survivors could not write down, but that their bones preserved for us instead. At burial sites across Ice Age Europe, wherever conditions have allowed human remains to survive intact enough for careful study, researchers consistently find something that is difficult to sit with, but important not to look away from. A very large proportion of individuals recovered from these populations in some well-studied cemetery samples. Closer to half of all burials are infants and young children. This is not unique to this particular era of human history. High childhood mortality was tragically the norm across nearly the entire span of our species' existence right up until shockingly recent centuries. But the specific patterns visible in Ice Age remains the timing of certain fractures, the telltale signs on bone that indicate prolonged nutritional stress during a body's most vulnerable growing years, point clearly toward cold and hunger as recurring seasonal killers, striking hardest exactly when winter stores ran thin and the built shelters that had seemed so sturdy in autumn were tested by the deepest cold of the year. I want to describe one particular burial that archaeologists uncovered at Sungir, a site in Russia dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, not far in time or place from the mammoth bone dwellers we've already spent time with, because I think it captures something about this world more completely than any statistic could. Two children, likely no older than early adolescents, were buried there head to head in a single grave, their bodies adorned with an almost unbelievable quantity of ivory beads, thousands of them carefully carved, each one representing hours upon hours of skilled labor from someone who loved them enough to spend that time. Alongside them were placed long, straightened mammoth ivory spears, remarkable objects requiring rare technical mastery to produce laid beside children too young to have earned such treasures through their own deeds. Scholars still debate exactly what these children's status within their community might have been, whether the burial reflects inherited standing, a devastating loss the group needed to mark with unusual ceremony, or something else we may never fully recover from the evidence alone. But whatever the precise explanation, one thing comes through, unmistakably. Someone grieved these two children with a depth and a labour of love that has survived physically for 34,000 years. The cold that likely helped take them did not erase the tenderness that answered their loss. This is the part of the story I think matters most to hold on to honestly. The shelters we have been tracing, the caves chosen with such care, the mammoth bone walls raised against impossible wind, were never simply engineering triumphs to admire from a comfortable distance. They were desperate loving acts undertaken by people who understood exactly what was at stake if they failed. Every wall built on that open step was built in part for the smallest members of the group, for children who could not yet survive a night of true exposure on their own strength alone. And despite everything, despite the very best shelter a Paleolithic mind could design and a Paleolithic hand could build, the cold still won far too often. It is worth asking honestly whether we can even fully imagine what it took to keep trying anyway, generation after generation, knowing the odds and building the next shelter regardless. The physical toll extended well beyond childhood too, reaching every stage of life in ways that shaped how these communities were forced to organize themselves. Analysis of adult skeletons from across this period reveals bones that are on average considerably more robust and heavily built than those of people living today, a difference researchers attribute to the sheer sustained physical demands of this existence. Decades of hauling firewood or bone across long distances, of dragging hides and building materials, of walking enormous distances, following herds across landscapes, offering no easier alternative. This was a life lived almost entirely through the body, and the skeleton itself became a permanent record of exactly how demanding that life truly was. Healed injuries appear with striking frequency, evidence of falls of accidents during difficult hunts, of the kind of physical toll that simply came with trying to survive in a landscape offering no margin for error. And yet, as we touched on earlier in this story, many of these injuries healed cleanly, which tells us something important in its own right. Someone cared for the injured through weeks or months of reduced usefulness to the group, sharing food, providing warmth, offering whatever comfort was possible in a world where every extra mouth to feed represented a genuine burden on limited resources. That kind of sustained compassion offered, without any guarantee of future repayment, deserves to be recognized as clearly as the hardship itself. There is also a deeper, quieter danger connected to shelter during this era that rarely gets mentioned at all, and it concerns something as basic as breathing. A well-built shelter that traps warmth from a fire will by the same physical logic trap smoke as well, unless ventilation is managed with real care. Researchers studying the layout of hearths within enclosed Ice Age dwellings, including the mammoth bone structures we explored earlier, have found evidence suggesting that smoke exposure was a genuine chronic hazard of this newly built form of shelter, one that simply did not exist for people sleeping in the open air or in shallow, well-ventilated rock shelters. Some skeletal remains from this period show signs consistent with the respiratory stress that researchers believe may connect to prolonged exposure to smoke in poorly ventilated enclosed spaces. The evidence remains far from conclusive, since so many factors can affect bone in ways that are difficult to separate this far removed in time, and scholars remain genuinely divided over how significant this particular hazard actually was across different populations and different shelter designs. But the underlying tension it points toward feels real regardless of the precise numbers. Every solution these early builders found seems to have carried its own new cost tucked quietly inside it. The same enclosed walls that kept out the killing cold also concentrated in some cases a slower, subtler danger that the open world had simply never presented before. It would be easy, hearing all of this together, to walk away with an impression of relentless suffering, and I do not want to leave you with that, because it would not be true to the fuller picture the evidence actually paints. Alongside every sign of hardship, the archaeological record from these same shelters also preserves something warmer, something worth holding on to with equal weight. Ornaments crafted purely for beauty with no practical survival function at all appear consistently at these sites. Carved ivory pendants, beads shaped from shell traded across enormous distances from populations living near distant coastlines, pigments used to colour both bodies and belongings. People living inside these hard-won shelters were not merely enduring existence, they were decorating it, marking their bodies and their belongings with beauty for reasons that had nothing to do with staying warm or staying fed. That detail matters enormously because it tells us these were not simply survival machines huddled against the cold. They were fully human beings, capable of joy, of aesthetic pleasure, of wanting to look beautiful to the people they loved, even while facing a world this demanding. So what emerges from this chapter of the story when we look at it honestly and completely is neither pure triumph nor pure tragedy, but something more truthful than either. These early builders had genuinely changed the terms of their survival learning to raise walls where none had grown naturally, learning to hold warmth inside a structure their own hands had designed. And still the world they lived in remained one where children died with devastating regularity, where injury and illness carried real and lasting risk, where even success came wrapped in new dangers nobody could have anticipated the first time they sealed a hide wall a little too tightly against the cold. Perhaps that tension more than anything else is the truest brutal core of this entire chapter in our species' story. Not one single catastrophe, but the accumulated weight of an existence lived permanently at the edge of what the body and the will could endure, met again and again, by people who kept building anyway, kept decorating their lives with beauty anyway, kept burying their children with thousands of hours of careful, loving labour poured into beads that would outlast every one of them by tens of thousands of years. What I find myself returning to thinking about all of this is not really the hardship itself, but what these people did in response to it. Because from here the story begins to shift toward something slightly different, toward the physical evidence itself, the actual bones and post holes and ash layers that let us reconstruct any of this at all, and toward the genuine ongoing debates among the people who study these sites. Most closely debates about what exactly some of these strange ancient structures were truly for, and whether everything we think we understand about this era is quite as settled as it might seem from the outside looking in. Let me take you now into the actual work of uncovering all of this, because I think the process itself deserves a place in the story, not just the conclusions it eventually produces. Almost everything we know about shelter this far back in human history survives only as absence, echo and shadow. Wood rots. Hide decays within decades unless conditions are extraordinary. What remains, if we are fortunate, are the things that resist time far better than flesh or fibre ever could. Post holes preserved as subtle discoloration in ancient soil, stone tools scattered exactly where they were dropped, ash and charcoal from long-dead fires and bone, sometimes remarkably well preserved, sometimes reduced to fragments requiring extraordinary patience to piece back together. Reconstructing an entire vanished way of living from evidence this fragmentary is in many ways closer to careful detective work than to anything most people imagine when they picture archaeology. Consider what it actually took to properly understand a site like Migrating, the mammoth bone dwelling we spent time with earlier in this story. It was discovered almost by complete accident in 1965, when a farmer digging a cellar in a village in central Ukraine struck what he initially assumed must be an unusually dense deposit of stone, only to realize he had broken into a wall built from ancient bone. What followed was decades of painstaking excavation conducted largely by Soviet and later Ukrainian archaeologists, working through bitter winters and difficult political circumstances, carefully mapping the exact position of every single bone before it was ever lifted from the ground. Because the arrangement itself, which skull sat where, which tusk curved, in which direction, carried as much information as the bone's physical condition. Move a single element without recording it precisely, and an entire layer of understanding about how the structure was actually built could be lost permanently. This kind of careful, unglamorous documentation is what eventually allows researchers to ask genuinely sophisticated questions of the evidence. Questions that go far beyond simply confirming a structure existed. Take the matter of how these mammoth bone dwellings were actually roofed, a detail you might assume would be obvious, but which remains honestly one of the more contested points in this entire field. No hide covering survives after tens of thousands of years, which means researchers have had to reconstruct the roofing method entirely through indirect evidence, the angle and wear patterns on the bones themselves. Comparison with the structural logic of shelters built by more recent Arctic and subarctic peoples using similarly limited materials and careful experimental archaeology in which modern researchers have actually attempted to build working replicas using period-appropriate tools and techniques, learning firsthand just how physically demanding the original construction must have been. These experimental builds have proven remarkably useful, revealing practical details that no amount of staring at excavated bone alone could have taught how many people a project like this likely required working simultaneously, roughly how many days of sustained labour a structure of this scale probably demanded, and which specific joints and load-bearing arrangements actually hold together under real weather, as opposed to merely looking plausible on paper. And yet for every genuine insight, this kind of careful reconstruction offers deep and legitimate uncertainty remains woven through nearly every major site from this era. And I think it is worth walking through a few of these honestly, because it says something true about how history actually gets built from fragments rather than delivered whole. Return with me for a moment to Ohalo, a site on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in what is now Israel that we have not yet had the chance to explore properly. Roughly 23,000 years ago, a small human community lived here beside the lake, and an extraordinary combination of circumstances, a sudden rise in water level that submerged the site shortly after it was abandoned, sealing it beneath layers of mud and sediment in low oxygen conditions, preserved something that almost never survives from this era at all: actual plant remains, actual traces of woven material. Archaeologists excavating Ohalo found the remnants of small oval huts, roughly 3 to 4 meters across, built from branches of tamarisk and willow bent and interwoven into a domed frame likely covered originally with brush and grasses, with the impression of the woven wall structure itself preserved directly in the compacted earthen floor beneath it. This is quite simply one of the oldest surviving examples anywhere on Earth of an actual human dwelling built from plant material rather than bone or stone, and the level of preservation is so unusual that researchers have even been able to identify traces of a woven sleeping mat inside one of the huts, along with scattered seeds from more than local plant species, suggesting a diet far more varied and carefully managed than a simple picture of desperate Ice Age survival might suggest. But even a site as remarkably preserved as Ohalo carries real unresolved questions. Was this a genuinely permanent year-round settlement or a favoured seasonal camp, returned to again and again, but abandoned for parts of each year as resources shifted with the seasons? The plant and fish remains recovered from the site suggest activity across multiple seasons, which points toward at least a partially settled pattern of life, remarkably early for anywhere in the world. But scholars still debate exactly how to characterize the underlying rhythm of that settlement, whether these were people beginning to loosen their ties to constant movement or people who had simply found one location worth returning to more often than most while remaining fundamentally mobile in every other respect. The evidence remains genuinely open to more than one reasonable interpretation, and I think that honesty matters more than a tidy answer would. The debates surrounding Terra Marta, the French coastal site we touched on earlier in this story, run even deeper, and they illustrate something important about how fragile the evidence from the very oldest sites in this story actually is. When the original excavations took place in the 1960s under significant time pressure, because the site sat directly in the path of planned urban construction, the archaeological techniques available for careful, slow, methodical documentation were simply less advanced than what researchers rely on today. Some of the original interpretations, including the confident reconstruction of oval hut outlines complete with central hearths, have since been challenged by researchers who argue the post holes could plausibly reflect natural sedimentary processes rather than deliberate construction. Other specialists continue to defend the original interpretation, pointing to the consistency and spacing of the patterns as difficult to explain through natural causes alone. Because the site itself was built over decades ago and can no longer be re-excavated with modern methods, this particular debate may never be fully resolved, and I think that is worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over. Sometimes the deepest history leaves us with real, permanent uncertainty, not because researchers have failed, but because the physical record itself simply does not preserve enough to settle every question with total confidence. There is a broader methodological challenge running underneath nearly all of this evidence, one worth naming directly, because it shapes how carefully every claim in this story needs to be held. Distinguishing a genuinely ancient hearth built and used by human hands from the scattered debris left by a natural wildfire that happened to burn across the same location thousands of years earlier requires extraordinarily careful analysis, examining the precise pattern of heat distortion in surrounding soil. The presence or absence of associated tools and food remains, and the overall shape and concentration of the burned material itself. At several sites across this long span of human history, researchers have had to revise earlier interpretations once more. Rigorous testing became available, occasionally downgrading what had once been described confidently as a deliberate human hearth to something more accurately labelled as probable, or even in a small number of disappointing cases, natural in origin after all. This is not a weakness in the field. It is, if anything, a sign of a discipline taking its own claims seriously enough to keep testing them, even when the answer turns out to be less exciting than the original headline suggested. What continues to strengthen our confidence in the broader story even amid these individual uncertainties is the sheer mutually reinforcing weight of evidence arriving from entirely independent sites, methods and research teams across multiple continents. The genetic evidence from human body lice pointing toward clothing's emergence roughly 100,000 years ago was developed through an entirely different scientific method than the isotopic bone analysis used to trace mammoth scavenging patterns at Migrating, which in turn has nothing methodologically in common with the precision uranium-thorium dating techniques that finally placed the Bruniquel stalagmite circles at 176,000 years old. These are separate lines of evidence developed by separate specialists using separate techniques, arriving independently at a consistent, coherent overall picture, one that has been strengthened rather than undermined by each new dating breakthrough, each new careful re-excavation, each new experimental reconstruction attempted by researchers determined to understand exactly how these ancient builders actually accomplished what they did. Is there a temptation in a field this rich with genuine mystery to fill in the remaining gaps with more confidence than the evidence actually supports? I think there is, honestly, and I think the best researchers working in this field today are the ones most willing to say, plainly, we are not certain this remains debated. The picture here is still incomplete. That honesty is not a weakness in the story we've been building together tonight. It is in a strange way exactly what makes it trustworthy, because what does survive, what has been confirmed again and again through independent methods and careful patient re-examination, tells us something genuinely remarkable about the people we have been walking alongside through this entire story, people who, faced with almost nothing the natural world was willing to hand them freely built shelter anyway, out of bone and branch and stone, leaving behind just enough trace, just enough echo in the soil and the ash and the ancient lice clinging to fibres long since turned to dust for us to still be piecing their story back together, fire by fire, wall by wall, tens of thousands of years later, in the quiet of a night very much like the ones they once endured themselves. There is a particular kind of disagreement running through this film that goes beyond simple questions of dating or preservation, and I think it deserves its own careful telling, because it touches something deeper than method. It touches the question of what we actually think these ancient people were capable of in the first place. For much of the 20th century, the dominant framework used to interpret early human behavior rested on a fairly clean assumption. Modern humans, our own species, arrived on the scene roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa, and only much later, sometime after around 50,000 years ago, did something researchers once called a cognitive revolution supposedly take hold. A sudden flowering of symbolic thought, complex planning, and genuine innovation that separated truly modern human behavior from everything that came before it, including from other human species like the Neanderthals. Under this older view, Neanderthals in particular were often cast as capable but fundamentally limited, strong, resilient, able to survive brutal conditions but lacking the deeper spark of imagination and forward planning that supposedly defined our own species alone. Bruniquel Cave, the site we spent time with earlier in this story, the stalagmite circles built deep in total darkness 176,000 years ago, landed in this field like a genuine shock to that entire framework. Because Neanderthals built those structures roughly 130,000 years before any version of the so-called cognitive revolution was ever supposed to have occurred, and more than 100,000 years before our own species had even reached the European continent at all. When the precise new dating results were finally published, they did not simply add one more interesting site to the record. They forced a genuine reckoning within the field itself, a public, sometimes uncomfortable acknowledgement that an entire generation of assumptions about which human species were capable of deliberate organized construction had been built on evidence that was simply too thin to support the confident story researchers had been telling. This kind of reckoning is worth naming, honestly, because it says something important about how history actually gets written and rewritten over time. Scholars still debate exactly how to characterize Neanderthal cognition in light of evidence like Bruniquel, and the disagreement runs in more than one direction. Some researchers now argue for something close to full cognitive parity, with early modern humans pointing not only to the stalagmite circles but also to other Neanderthal sites showing evidence of pigment use, deliberate burial, and even possible personal ornamentation using eagle talons deliberately modified and apparently worn or displayed rather than simply collected. Other specialists, while fully accepting that Bruniquel demonstrates real planning and organizational capacity, remain more cautious about extending that conclusion into every corner of Neanderthal life, noting that a single remarkable site, however striking, does not necessarily prove that this kind of deep cave construction was common practice rather than a rare, perhaps even singular achievement. The evidence remains genuinely open on this question, and I think both sides of that disagreement are arguing in good faith, working from the same physical evidence toward conclusions that depend heavily on how much weight a single extraordinary discovery should be allowed to carry. A closely related, and I think even more surprising debate concerns the actual purpose behind some of the very earliest constructed shelters we have discussed tonight, and it centers on a question that might not have occurred to you at all while we were walking through the mammoth bone dwellings of the Ukrainian steppe. Were all of these structures actually built primarily for warmth and physical shelter in the straightforward sense we have been assuming throughout most of this story? Or did some of them serve a different, more social or symbolic function that simple survival logic alone does not fully explain? This question arises directly from careful re-examination of certain mammoth bone structures, including some found at Migrating, and related sites where researchers have noticed something that does not fit neatly into a pure survival explanation. Some of these bone circles appear considerably more elaborate than basic shelter would strictly require, arranged with the kind of deliberate visual patterning, skulls oriented in careful repeating configurations, tusks arched with what looks like real attention to symmetry and visual effect rather than only structural necessity. A minority of researchers studying these sites have proposed that at least some of these structures may have served a dual purpose, functioning as genuine shelter, yes, but also carrying a symbolic or communal significance, perhaps marking a gathering place used by multiple family groups coming together periodically, rather than a simple single-family dwelling occupied continuously through an entire season. I want to be careful and honest about how this particular idea is received within the broader field, because it remains quite genuinely a minority position, rather than an established consensus. Most researchers working on these sites continue to interpret the mammoth bone structures primarily through the lens of practical shelter, pointing to the clear correlation between structure location and proximity to freshwater game trails and defensible terrain. Strong evidence that survival, not symbolism, drove the fundamental design choices being made. The more elaborate patterning some researchers have highlighted. These more cautious voices argue may simply reflect skilled, experienced builders taking pride in their work or following an established aesthetic tradition passed down through the group without necessarily implying any deeper ceremonial function beyond the practical business of staying warm and alive through an ice age winter. Both interpretations remain live within the field, and I find something genuinely moving in that ongoing disagreement, because it reflects real careful people looking at the same ancient bones and asking honestly what kind of beings built this. People solving an urgent physical problem alone, or people solving that same problem while also quietly reaching for something more than mere survival. There is a third area of real scholarly disagreement worth walking through carefully tonight, because it touches directly on a question we raised earlier, without fully resolving it, the question of how mobile. These shelter-building communities actually remained, even after they had learned to construct real substantial dwellings capable of lasting an entire season or more. The traditional view held broadly for many decades imagined even these more advanced shelter-building groups as fundamentally thoroughly nomadic, constructing elaborate mammoth bone dwellings for a single hard winter, then abandoning them completely once spring arrived and the herds began their seasonal migration elsewhere, never intending or expecting to return to that exact same structure again. Under this view, a shelter like the one found at Migrating represented an extraordinary one-time investment of labour, remarkable precisely because it was not meant to become anything like a permanent home in the way we would use that word today. More recent research, however, has begun to complicate this picture in ways that some specialists find genuinely compelling, and others still regard with appropriate caution. Careful analysis of certain mammoth bone sites has revealed evidence of what researchers describe as sequential occupation, meaning some structures appear to have been used then partially dismantled, or allowed to weather and then rebuilt or repaired, using at least some of the same bones at intervals that suggest possible repeated seasonal return to the exact same location, rather than a single use, followed by complete and permanent abandonment. If this interpretation holds up under continued research, and scholars still genuinely debate whether it does across every relevant site, it would suggest something quietly remarkable. Communities on the open steppe developing an early form of what researchers sometimes call logistical mobility, moving seasonally with the herds as their ancestors always had, but returning again and again to a small number of favoured previously built locations, rather than starting entirely from nothing at every single stop along their annual route. That would represent a genuinely new relationship with the concept of place itself, not yet a permanent settlement in any meaningful sense, but no longer quite the same as the constant directionless wandering that defined so much of the earlier chapters in this story either. I do not think it is my place sitting here telling you this story to resolve debates that the researchers who have spent entire careers on these exact questions have not yet resolved among themselves. What I think matters more, and what I hope has come through clearly across everything we have covered tonight, is how genuinely alive this field remains. How far it is from a closed book with every answer already settled and filed neatly away. Every new dating technique, every careful re-excavation using tools that simply did not exist when a site was first uncovered decades ago. Every fresh look at bones that have sat quietly in a museum drawer for half a century carries the real possibility of overturning something we thought we understood and replacing it with a picture that is stranger, richer, and often more admirable than the one that came before it. What none of these open questions change, I think, is the deeper emotional truth sitting underneath all of them. Whether a given mammoth bone circle served purely practical purposes or carried some additional social weight, we can only partially glimpse now whether Neanderthals at Bruniquel were solving an urgent, immediate problem or reaching in that deep darkness towards something closer to shared meaning. The people at the centre of every one of these debates were still unmistakably doing something remarkable. They were imagining shelter into existence where the world had offered them none, adapting that vision again and again as conditions demanded, and leaving behind just enough trace contested and debated, as some of it remains, for us to still be sitting here tens of thousands of years later trying honestly to understand exactly what they accomplished and why. And once shelter had genuinely, undeniably become something humans could build rather than merely find, the consequences of that shift would ripple forward through every part of how these communities live together in ways none of the original builders could possibly have foreseen. The first night they finally slept warm inside walls their own hands had raised. Consider what actually changes inside a group of people. One shelter becomes something reliable, something that can be counted on to still be standing tomorrow, rather than something searched for anew with every single sunset. It sounds like a small shift. In practice, it rearranged nearly everything about how these communities live together. The most immediate consequence concerns something we have already touched on lightly, but which deserves fuller attention. Now, the question of sleep itself and what genuine sustained rest actually meant for a population that had spent the overwhelming majority of its existence sleeping in conditions offering only partial safety at best. Researchers who study sleep patterns in modern populations still living without electric light in order to build comparative models for how ancient humans likely slept have found that reliable shelter appears to correlate strongly with deeper, more continuous rest, fewer disrupted nights spent half alert to sounds moving in the dark, more consistent overall sleep architecture across a group. This might seem like a minor physiological detail, but the downstream effects are anything but small. Chronic sleep disruption carries real cost to immune function, to cognitive performance, to basic emotional regulation within a group living in close quarters under constant pressure. A community sleeping behind walls that could reasonably be trusted to hold through the night was not simply more comfortable than one sleeping in the open. It was very likely healthier, sharper, and better equipped to face the genuine dangers that remained in ways that would have compounded quietly across every single night for years at a time. Shelter also appears to have reshaped something even more fundamental: the structure of the family and social unit itself. Once a dwelling existed that could reliably hold a fire, hold warmth, and hold a defined group of people together within a fixed physical space, that space itself began to organize behavior in ways open ground never had. We touched earlier on the clear zoning visible at long-occupied rock shelters like Abric Romani, distinct areas for cooking, for hide, preparation for sleeping, each held consistently in roughly the same location across generations of use. That same pattern appears in even more pronounced form at the mammoth bone dwellings of the Ukrainian steppe, where excavators have identified separate activity zones within and around individual structures, evidence of tool production concentrated in one area, food processing in another, distinct hearths apparently serving distinct household groupings within a larger shared settlement. This is, in a very real sense, the birth of domestic space as an organising concept, the idea that different activities belong in different places, and that a well-run household requires some degree of deliberate spatial arrangement rather than simply happening wherever people happen to be standing at the time. It's worth pausing to ask what this kind of spatial organisation actually required of the people living inside it, because the answer touches something surprisingly modern. Shared physical space held consistently over time demands a level of ongoing negotiation and social coordination that a constantly mobile existence never quite forces into being in the same way. Who sleeps where, whose hearth this is, how waste and refuse get managed within a structure people intend to keep using for months rather than abandoning after a single night. Archaeological evidence from several of these longer occupied sites, including careful analysis of refuse patterns at Migrating, suggests these early communities were already developing consistent, deliberate practices for managing exactly these kinds of questions. Discard zones kept clearly separate from living and sleeping areas, for instance, a level of domestic organisation that implies real, ongoing social agreement about how a shared space ought to function. None of this happens automatically. It requires communication, compromise, and a shared understanding built and maintained across an entire group, evidence in its own quiet way of social structures growing more complex alongside the physical structures these people were now capable of building. There is a demographic consequence to reliable shelter as well, one that connects directly back to the hard truths we sat with earlier in this story. While Ice Age childhood mortality remained tragically high by any modern standard throughout this entire period, some researchers who study population patterns across different site types have noted a suggestive though not fully settled pattern. Communities associated with more substantial, longer-lasting constructed shelters appear in certain well-documented cases to show somewhat better survival outcomes for infants and young children compared to populations relying primarily on more exposed or temporary shelter types facing comparably harsh conditions. Scholars still debate how strongly this pattern holds once other variables are properly accounted for, since better shelter often correlates with other advantages too: richer local hunting grounds, more stable water sources, factors that are difficult to fully separate from shelter quality alone using the evidence currently available. But the underlying logic remains genuinely plausible, even amid that uncertainty, and worth sitting with honestly. A structure capable of reliably holding warmth through the coldest stretch of an Ice Age winter would very likely have mattered enormously for exactly the smallest, most vulnerable bodies in any given group, the infants and young children whose survival margins were always the thinnest to begin with. Shelter appears to have changed something else too, something less easily measured in bone or refuse pattern, but no less real for that. It changed what became possible to teach and to learn and to pass forward. A shared, reasonably stable dwelling space returned to consistently across an entire season or longer offers something that constant movement across open, unsheltered ground simply cannot. A consistent setting in which skilled work can be demonstrated slowly, patiently, and repeated across many sessions until real mastery develops. We touched earlier on the small child-sized tools found at some long-occupied cave sites. That same pattern of apparent deliberate instruction appears at several of the more substantial constructed dwellings from this era, as well evidence of ivory working and tool-making debris clustered in patterns consistent with an experienced worker seated beside someone considerably less skilled. working through the same basic techniques repeatedly, correcting errors, refining technique across what was very likely months, rather than the single rushed afternoon a temporary camp might have allowed. Reliable shelter, in other words, may have quietly functioned as something close to the earliest classroom our species ever built, not intentionally designed for that purpose, but naturally suited to it simply by virtue of holding people together safely in one place for long enough that real skill had the chance to take root and grow. I want to be honest about a tension running through everything we have covered in this part of the story, because I think it deserves to be named plainly rather than smoothed over. Better shelter did not mean an easier existence in any simple, straightforward sense. In some ways, it appears to have introduced entirely new categories of difficulty that a more mobile, less settled existence had never had to confront in quite the same way. Disease transmission, for instance, likely became a somewhat greater concern within larger, more consistently occupied dwellings where a group remained in close sustained proximity to the same shared space, the same waste, the same air for far longer stretches of time than a constantly moving band ever would have. We already touched on the very real possibility of smoke-related respiratory stress within enclosed shelters. Add to that the simple reality that any illness introduced into a group sharing an enclosed space consistently would have had far more opportunity to spread among the entire community than it would among people constantly dispersing and regrouping across open, well-ventilated ground. This does not mean reliable shelter was on balance a poor trade. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests these communities judged it well worth the cost choosing again and again, across tens of thousands of years, and multiple independent human populations to keep building and keep improving on exactly this approach. But it is worth resisting the temptation to imagine this transition as a simple, uncomplicated march from worse to better. Every genuine advance in this story, as we have seen again and again tonight, seems to have arrived carrying its own new set of costs tucked quietly inside it. Perhaps the deepest consequence of all, though, is one that is somewhat harder to see directly in bone or ash, but which nearly every researcher working in this field would agree sits underneath everything else we have discussed tonight. Reliable built shelter appears to have fundamentally altered how these communities related to the concept of a future at all. A nomadic existence moving constantly in response to immediate need tends to orient thinking heavily toward the present and the very near term. Where is water today? Where is game likely to be found this week? Where can we shelter tonight? A group capable of building a structure meant to last an entire season, meant to be returned to, meant to be repaired and improved upon rather than simply abandoned, is a group that has begun thinking meaningfully in longer stretches of time. Planning not just for tomorrow, but for an entire winter, still months away, investing real labour now in exchange for a benefit that will not be collected until much later. That shift in thinking from purely immediate to genuinely long-term may be one of the quietest and most consequential developments in this entire story, more foundational in some ways than any single structure we have examined tonight. Because that same capacity to imagine a future state that does not yet exist, to invest sustained effort now toward a benefit collected only much later, to cooperate with an entire group toward a shared goal that will not pay off for months, is the same underlying capacity that would eventually make possible everything that followed. This era, deliberate planting and harvesting, the careful management of herds rather than only pursuing wild ones, and eventually many thousands of years further along this same unbroken thread, the first true year-round settlements our species ever built. We are not there yet in this story, and I do not want to rush ahead of where we actually stand tonight. The people we have been walking alongside in their mammoth bone dwellings and their Deep cave circles and their small woven huts beside an ancient lake were still in every meaningful sense. Mobile people following herds, responding to season-building shelter that was substantial and enduring, but not yet permanent in the way we would use that word today. But the seed of everything that eventually followed the entire long arc of human settlement agriculture, and finally the first true cities, was already present quietly in every one of those choices to build rather than simply move on to invest. Effort now for warmth collected months later to return again and again to a place worth calling something close to home. What remains for us to explore now is where exactly that seed eventually led, and what still survives in the world all around you right now of the very first walls human hands ever dared to raise against an indifferent sky. The seed we left resting at the close of the last thread did not stay dormant for very long, measured against the vast scale of time this story has already asked you to hold. Somewhere between roughly 14,000 and 12,000 years ago, in the hill country and river valleys of the eastern Mediterranean, a region researchers now call the Levant, something genuinely new began to take shape, something that would finally close the long distance between shelter built for a season and shelter built to last a lifetime. Archaeologists refer to the people responsible for this shift as the Natufian culture, and what makes them remarkable is not any single dramatic invention, but a quiet, sustained commitment to staying in one place that none of the communities we have walked alongside so far in this story had ever fully attempted. At sites like Ain Mala near the Sea of Galilee, not far at all from where the woven huts of Ohalo had stood many thousands of years earlier, Natufian families built round stone-founded houses with sunken floors, sturdy post holes for real roof supports, and hearths positioned with obvious permanence in mind. These were not shelters raised for a hard winter and abandoned once the herds moved on. Radiocarbon evidence and careful study of the surrounding refuse layers built up gradually over what appears to be genuine long-term habitation suggest these structures were lived in, repaired, and rebuilt on the exact same foundations across many successive generations. For what may be the first time in the entire span of the human story we have followed tonight, people were staying. Not because the land forced a temporary halt, but because they had found somewhere worth calling permanently their own. What made this kind of true settlement possible when it had remained essentially unreachable for every community we have discussed until now was not a sudden leap in raw building skill. The Natufians were not in any meaningful sense better builders than the people who raised the mammoth bone dwellings of Mjirich, or wove the domed huts beside the ancient shore of Ohalo. What had changed instead was the surrounding landscape itself, and the opportunity it finally offered. The Levant during this period supported dense, reliable stands of wild wheat and barley along with abundant gazelle herds moving through relatively predictable seasonal patterns, a combination rich and consistent enough that for the first time a group could remain in a single location year-round and still reliably feed itself without needing to follow migrating game across hundreds of miles the way nearly every community before them had been required to do. Permanent shelter, it turns out, was never simply a matter of finally learning how to build well enough. It required a landscape generous enough to make staying rather than moving the wiser choice. I find something worth sitting with in that detail because it reframes so much of what we have covered across this entire story tonight. The builders of Bruniquel and Mjirich and Terra Amata were not less capable than the people who eventually settled at Ain Malaha. They were in every sense that matters every bit as intelligent, every bit as resourceful, every bit as capable of imagining a structure into being through nothing but patience and cooperation and hard-won skill. What they lacked was not ability, it was opportunity, a landscape rich and stable enough to finally reward staying put, rather than continuing to follow the herds that had sustained human life for nearly the entire span of our existence up to this point. Once that first true permanence took hold, the pace of change accelerated in a way that stands in real contrast to everything that came before it. Within a few thousand years of the earliest Natufian settlements, communities across the same broader region began deliberately cultivating wild grains, rather than simply gathering them, gradually selecting, whether fully consciously or not, for traits like larger seeds and stalks that held their grain longer, before scattering naturally on the wind. This is the slow, patient beginning of agriculture itself, and it is worth noting honestly that scholars still debate exactly how deliberate this earliest cultivation truly was, whether it represents a clear intentional strategy from its very outset, or a more gradual, almost accidental drift toward farming, born from repeated small choices about which plants were worth returning to harvest again. Either way, the underlying pattern connects directly back to everything we have traced across this entire story. A community capable of building shelter meant to last, capable of investing real effort, now for a benefit collected only months or years later, was already equipped with exactly the kind of long-term thinking that farming itself would eventually demand at an even greater scale. By around 11,000 years ago, at a site called Jericho in what is now the West Bank, this trajectory reached a genuinely striking milestone. Excavations there have revealed the remains of a substantial stone wall, more than 3.5 meters tall in places, along with a large stone tower built alongside it still standing, in partial ruin today, as very possibly the oldest known example of monumental architecture constructed anywhere on Earth. I want to be honest with you about the genuine mystery still surrounding this particular structure, because it captures something true about how much remains unresolved, even this deep into the story of human settlement. Researchers remain divided over the tower's original purpose. Some argue it served a clearly defensive function, protecting an early settled community and its precious stores of cultivated grain from raiders or rival groups. Others point to its unusual internal staircase and specific orientation and suggest it may have carried ceremonial or symbolic significance well beyond simple defense, perhaps connected to marking the passage of seasons or serving some communal gathering function we can only partially reconstruct from the stone alone. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete, and I think that uncertainty arriving at the very moment permanent human settlement had finally fully taken hold feels like a fitting echo of everything we have walked through together tonight. Even as shelter became more solid, more monumental, more clearly permanent than anything the mammoth bone builders or the cave dwellers before them had ever managed, the deepest human motivations behind exactly why we build the way we do remained every bit as layered and difficult to fully untangle as they always had been. What I find most moving thinking about this entire arc together is how directly the thread runs from the very beginning of tonight's story to structures still standing, however weathered, in the world around us today. Consider the humble hearth that small managed fire tended so carefully by the woman on the frozen plain at the very start of everything we have covered tonight. That same basic principle, a controlled, contained source of warmth held at the center of a living space, appears essentially unchanged in its core logic in the fireplace built into homes across Europe and North America for centuries afterward, and in the wood stove still warming rural houses in cold regions of the world at this very moment. The specific technology has changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying human insight it rests on, that warmth held and managed deliberately within a defined space, keeps a family alive through the hardest nights of the year, has not changed at all across more than 1 million years. Or consider something as seemingly minor as the layout of the home you yourself might be resting in right now as you listen to this. The zoned living space we traced at Abrik Romani and at the mammoth bone dwellings of the Ukrainian steppe. a defined area for preparing food kept meaningfully separate from where people actually sleep, still shapes nearly every home built anywhere in the world today, so completely internalized as simply correct that it rarely occurs to anyone to ask where that instinct originally came from. It came from tens of thousands of years of trial of learning, through hard experience which arrangements actually worked, and which invited disaster refined patiently across more generations than any written record could ever fully capture. There is a more literal, physical kind of legacy worth naming too, one that connects even more directly to specific sites we have spent real time with tonight. At Çatalhöyük, a remarkable Neolithic settlement in what is now Turkey, dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, and therefore considerably later than the Natufian sites we discussed earlier, archaeologists have found something that speaks directly across this entire span of time we have traced together. Houses there were built so closely packed against one another that residents entered not through ground-level doors, but through openings cut into the roof, climbing down ladders into the living space below a design that offered real defensive advantage but also created an extraordinarily dense interconnected community. And within the walls and floors of these homes, archaeologists have found something that would not have felt entirely foreign to the mammoth bone builders we walked alongside earlier in this story. The people of Çatalhöyük buried their dead beneath the floors of their own homes, often directly under the sleeping platforms where the living continued to rest each night, generation after generation layering the deceased and the living within the very same walls across what researchers estimate may have been many decades of continuous use for a single house. Scholars still debate the deeper meaning behind this practice, whether it reflects ancestor reverence, a desire to keep loved ones physically close even after death, or something more complex we may never fully recover. But the underlying instinct feels to me at least deeply continuous with everything we have traced across this entire story. A home, once it became something permanent enough to matter this much, was never simply a shelter from weather. It became a place woven together with memory, with grief, with love that outlasted the individual lives it once held. I think that is in the end the truest legacy of everything we have walked through together tonight, more than any single wall or roof or carefully arranged hearth. What began so many hundreds of thousands of years ago as a desperate, urgent solution to cold and predators and an indifferent sky gradually became something else entirely, a place capable of holding not just bodies safely through a hard winter, but relationships. Memory teaching passed patiently from one generation to the next, grief honoured rather than simply endured alone. Every home standing anywhere in the world tonight, however different it may look from a circle of mammoth bone or a stone tower rising from the plain at Jericho, still carries that same fundamental inheritance within it. Walls, built not merely to keep weather out, but to hold something worth protecting safely within. And so we arrive gently at the close of this long unbroken thread, having walked together from a species sleeping exposed in trees, through caves defended against bears twice the size of any predator alive today, through walls raised from the very bones of the animals that sustained the people who built them, and finally to the first true permanent settlements our species ever dared to build and stay within. What remains now is simply to rest here for a moment together in the quiet weight of everything this story has actually meant before we let it settle fully into stillness. Let us gather everything together, now gently the way you might gather scattered belongings before finally closing a door for the night. We began this story with a woman on an open plain feeding a small fire against a wind that had been building since dusk, holding her child close because there was quite literally nothing else standing between that infant and the full weight of an ice age. I have thought about her often across everything we have covered tonight, and I find myself returning to her now at the end, because I think she holds something the entire story has been circling around from the very start. She did not know she was living through what we would later call prehistory. She did not know her small desperate fire was part of a chain stretching back nearly 2 million years or forward towards stone towers and settled villages, and eventually every house standing in every quiet neighbourhood in the world tonight. She only knew the wind and the cold and the small warm weight of the child in her arms and the simple urgent task of keeping both of them alive until morning. That is in the end what this entire story has really been about. Not architecture, not archaeology, though we have spent many hours together tonight walking carefully through both. It has been about what people are willing to do generation after generation for the people they love, when the world itself offers almost nothing freely. Think of the full distance we have travelled together. We began with ancestors sleeping in trees, weaving fresh nests each night from branches and leaves, offering no permanence at all, only a few hours of lative safety before the whole fragile structure was abandoned at dawn. We watched fire itself become something tended and carried a portable island of safety pushed back against the dark nearly 1 million years before any wall was ever deliberately raised. We walked through caves held onto across 40,000 years and more than 200 stacked hearths, each new fire laid quietly on top of the ashes of every fire that came before it. We stood in our imagination on open steppe, where no cave existed for 100 miles in any direction, and watched people solve that impossible problem by building walls from the bones of animals they had already learned to live alongside, sometimes hunting them, sometimes simply gathering what the land had already provided. We went deep into total darkness, with Neanderthals carrying fire further underground than any practical need for warmth could fully explain, arranging broken stone into shapes whose true purpose may never be fully known to us. And we followed the thread all the way forward to the first true permanent settlements, houses standing on the same foundation for generations, the dead buried gently beneath the floors where the living continued to sleep each night above them. Across every single stage of that journey, the same fundamental brutality remained constant even as the specific dangers changed shape again and again. Cold that could kill a body in a single hard night. Predators that had not yet learned to fear us the way they eventually would. Illness with no real treatment beyond patience and whatever comfort another person's presence could offer. Children lost far too young, far too often buried by parents who had done everything within their power, and watched it prove not quite enough anyway. This channel exists to tell you the truth of history rather than a softened version of it, and the honest truth of this particular story is that it was for almost the entirety of its span genuinely brutal. Life without walls meant life lived permanently close to a margin that could tip in a single bad season from difficult into fatal. And yet held alongside that hard truth sits something else equally real, something I do not think we should let the darkness of this story overshadow. Every single stage of this journey also shows us people refusing to simply accept the world as it was handed to them. A species with no natural claws, no thick fur, no great physical strength. Compared to the predators sharing its landscape, look directly at an impossible problem. Cold with no shelter, open ground with no caves, darkness with no fire, yet tamed and found an answer. Anyway, using nothing but patience, cooperation, and the accumulated hard-won knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. That capacity to imagine something that does not yet exist, and then build it with nothing but hands and time and shared effort, is in its own quiet way one of the most remarkable things our species has ever demonstrated. It shows up first in a simple ring of stacked mammoth skulls on a treeless plain. It shows up unmistakably in every home built anywhere in the world since. There is a piece of evidence I want to leave you with tonight. One small detail that I think crystallizes everything we have walked through together more completely than any broad summary could manage on its own. At Menhirik, inside the remains of that great mammoth bone dwelling we spent real time with earlier. Tonight, archaeologists found something easy to overlook amid the scale and strangeness of the structure surrounding it. A small carved piece of mammoth ivory shaped and decorated with a careful, deliberate pattern of lines found resting near the hearth at the very centre of the dwelling. It appears to be as closely as researchers have been able to determine a map, a simplified representation of the surrounding landscape, rivers and dwellings, marked with intentional care by someone who understood this territory well enough to render it in miniature on a piece of tusk small enough to hold in one hand. I find something almost unbearably moving in that object sitting quietly at the centre of everything we have covered tonight. Here were people whose entire existence depended on solving problems that could kill them within a single night cold hunger exposure, and yet they still found the time, the attention, the sheer surplus of care beyond bare survival to sit beside their hearth and carve a picture of the world they had learned to navigate. That small piece of ivory tells us something the walls themselves, remarkable as they are, cannot quite tell us on their own. These were not simply bodies enduring hardship, they were minds actively making sense of the world around them, understanding it, representing it, holding it in a form small enough to carry close enough to the fire to feel always like home. The wind outside my own window tonight is nothing like the wind that woman on the open plain endured all those thousands of years ago. I have walls around me that will not fail before morning. I have warmth I do not have to tend by hand through the darkest hours, and I think it is worth sitting with that difference, honestly, without guilt, but with real gratitude, because it did not arrive by accident. It arrived because countless generations of people whose names we will never know, whose faces we can only imagine from a scattering of bone and ash and carved ivory, decided again and again across nearly the entire span of human existence that the cold did not get the final word, that a wall could be built where none existed, that a child could be kept warm even here, even now, even against a sky that offered nothing freely at all. History does not owe us comfort, it only owes us the truth told carefully, told completely. And the truth tonight is this: every soft blanket pulled up around your shoulders right now carries the full weight of that ancient, unbroken effort behind it, stretching back further than written language, further than agriculture, further almost than memory itself can properly hold. You are in this very moment resting inside the answer to a problem our ancestors spent nearly 2 million years learning how to solve. Let the pace slow now. Let your breathing settle into something quieter. The story we have walked through tonight stretches back almost beyond imagining, and yet it comes down in the end to something very simple. A body seeking warmth. A hand reaching for another hand in the dark. A fire tended carefully through a long and difficult night because someone small and precious was depending on it staying lit. Empires would rise centuries later and empires would fall. Cities would be built from stone and abandoned and swallowed slowly by grass and time. Names that once meant everything to the people who carried them would be forgotten, entirely worn away like the edges of a stone tool left too long in the rain. But this one thing did not fade. The instinct to build shelter. The instinct to keep the people you love safe, warm breathing through whatever the night decides to bring. That instinct outlived every mammoth that ever walked the steppe. It outlived every ice age, every glacier, every landscape reshaped beyond recognition by forces far larger than any single human life. It is quietly still here. It is here in this room with you right now, in the walls holding back whatever weather moves outside tonight, in the simple ancient miracle of a body finally allowed to rest without fear. Somewhere tens of thousands of years ago, on ground with no caves and no trees, and nothing but open sky for miles in every direction, a group of people looked at an impossible winter and began stacking bone against bone anyway. They did not know their small circle of tusks and skulls would become the ancestor of every home ever built since. They only knew it needed to hold, and somehow against all that cold, against all that dark, it did.